Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cisco Optics Podcast, where we talk about pluggable optics for networks. The rise of hyperscale data centers has upended computing and network equipment business models over the past several years. The pluggable optics industry is no exception and has definitely been impacted. I'm fortunate enough to have as a guest today someone who has seen that transformation from the inside. This is episode 27, and we continue our second conversation with Ron Horan. You may remember him from a previous series of this podcast on silicon photonics. In this episode, we get into the growth of our industry and then discuss future trends. Ron attended the University of Texas at San Antonio for both his bachelor's and master's degrees. His master's thesis topic, entitled Synthetic Vision Landing Aid System, was patented as the first GPS aircraft landing aid. From 1994 to 99, while at Compaq, he earned 15 patent awards. In 2001, he joined Broadcom Corporation, where he managed field applications engineering for the compute segment team, ran program management in the networking BU, and was a senior director of sales and strategic account manager covering the Hewlett-Packard worldwide account. In 2011, Ron moved to Luxtera, where he worked as vice president of sales before moving into the role as vice president of marketing. Luxtera was eventually acquired by Cisco in 2019, where Ron now runs product management for the Cisco Client Optics Group. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast. On Apple Podcasts, you would follow us now. We're part of the Cisco Podcast Network. Check out our blog at blogs.cisco.com and search on hashtag Cisco Optics Blog, all one word, no hyphen, and no spaces. You'll find podcast notes and links there too. For our YouTube playlist, go to youtube.com and search on Cisco Optics. And for product information, go to cisco.com/go/optics. And now, join me as I talk with Ron Horan.
And so now, if you look at, this is public data on Lake County, and if you look at, there's some really interesting data out there that just came out. And so web scales, if you look at the entire optics, all the optics that get sold in a year, and this is direct detect, I don't think it includes coherent optics, so client optics. Web scales account for 63% of all optics sold in a year. I think that's from 2021.
Wow.
It's a big number. If you look at just the top five, they account for 38% of that. Or actually, I think it's 35% of that. I'm doing numbers off the top of my head, but they account for 35% of all optics sold in a year, 5 companies.
Wow.
So it's pretty amazing, the scale. And then if you look at the trend, it's again, this is Lake County I'm quoting. So, but if you look at just directionally correct trend, right? From 2021 to 2026, what is a $4 billion business for web scale is going to, just for optics alone, $4 billion is going to go to a $10 billion. It's going to grow, $6 billion over the next 5 years, according to.
And is that purely because of quantity, or is it also just because as we get to higher speeds, because we're not on the same Moore's law slope as like the rest of the semiconductor industry, are optics just getting more expensive as we get to higher speeds?
Well, I think it's a combination of scale. So you have these top 5 webs, but you have a lot of other web scales out there, right? That basically are growing also, like Apple. A couple examples would be Apple or Tencent or Oracle. Those are examples of web scales that are growing also, right? So they're increasing. The top 5 are increasing. They're just getting bigger and they need more bandwidth. And then the other thing that you could say about the web scales, and particularly the top 5, is they are the tip of the spear. I mean, they tend to basically be 2 to 3 years ahead of any other market segment. as far as buying the fastest and highest density optics out there. And so particularly like this, I said, the top 5, the web scales that are not in the top 5 are behind that, but not as much as some of the other market segments. I mean, there's still a bunch of market segments out there buying optics that are still buying 10 gig and below. The web scales are, deploying 400 gig, and they're going to be moving to 800 gig pretty soon. So you can see there's a big difference in, and you're right. The cost of the optics is, obviously if you're going to buy faster, higher density optics, it's going to cost more money, right? There's an interesting, so this is a generalization, but a web scale customer told me this story, which I think it's an interesting story. They said, if you go back 10 years ago, and you look at the cost of the switch, the switch and the chassis around it that they had to deploy, and you look at the cost of the optics that they had to buy to put in the switch, they said the switch was 80% of the cost, and the optics was 20% of the cost, or the interconnect was 20% of the cost. If you today, 10 years later, if you look at that same equation, the switch itself is 20% of the cost, and now the optics is 80% of the cost.
Yeah, at the latest and greatest, data rates, right?
Right, and so I mean, obviously, one thing you see from Cisco is they're putting a lot of emphasis on optics, right? They bought Lightwire back in 2010. They bought Luxtera in 2019. They bought Acacia just recently. And so, there's a lot of emphasis being put on optics, and because it's a big, it's big, right? And so if you take away one message about the web scales or the hyperscale companies, it's that they're big, and there's not a lot of them. There's probably less than 50 on the planet, where, relative to like enterprise customers who have thousands. Mm-hmm. But the hyperscales are big, and they're getting bigger, right? And so it's a big business. And so that's why you see companies putting a lot of emphasis on that market segment.
Yeah, and that shift from the 20% to 80%, that's what I was referring to about Moore's Law. I always thought that the switches are driven by the ASIC cost, right? And it's a semiconductor, right? So it follows Moore's Law pretty well. Optics kind of has its own Moore's Law, but it's not the same slope. Right?
Yeah, and it changes. It changes. It's just crazy. It's a crazy thing because, like with the switch, the roadmap is pretty straightforward. With optics, there's so many routes that these customers can take that it's, you have to kind of pick and choose your fights of what you're going to build and what you're not going to build, and what you're going to support, because it seems like everybody wants something different. So it's a little bit, it's a difficult space, but it's, like I said, it's worth it, right?
So what do you see in the future? What do you see coming up down the road? You mentioned 800 gig. Any other trends that seem like they're pretty likely to take hold?
Well, I think that we talked about, so if you just talk about trends in general, right, particularly as it applies to the hyperscales, we talked about multi-mode fiber and single mode fiber. Single mode fiber seems to be becoming more pervasive for the reasons we discussed. We talked about, what's basically the fact that the hyperscalers tend to be ahead of the market, ahead of everybody else. We talked about how, the optics purchase is getting bigger. Some other trends are, and what I just kind of alluded to a minute ago was basically that, that there was kind of a bifurcation in the industry as particular to the the hyperscalers, where you got basically multiple form factors, OSFP versus QSFP DD. Mm-hmm. You got multiple speeds, 200 gig versus 400 gig. Basically, it's kind of what I was alluding to is, everybody seemed to kind of go off in their own direction. And so
there's this fragmentation that's, instead of everyone going to one standard, there's multiple standards now.
So right. So there's
branches.
There's certain web, hyperscales that basically all went off and they're doing 200 gig deployments in their data center. So everybody seemed to be pretty much on the same page at 100 gig, but when we went to 200 gig and 400 gig, they kind of broke out, and you ended up with multiple form factors. You ended up with multiple connectorization. It kind of got really messy. But I think that what's happening now is, as even with 800 gig, you end up with those.
That was the third part of my new conversation with Ron Horan. Next time, we'll get into the future of 800 gig and 1.6 terabit data rates. Subscribe to this podcast, and we'd really appreciate you helping to get the word out. Share this with friends and colleagues that come to mind when you think of network technology and optics. And leave a review on Apple Podcast. We're also on all the other major podcast platforms. You may see the Cisco Podcast Network come up when you search for Cisco Optics Podcast. That's where we live, and you can find other great podcasts there too. Also, check out the Cisco Optics blogs at blogs.cisco.com and search on hashtag Cisco Optics blog, no spaces and no hyphens. We also have educational videos on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com and search on Cisco Optics. Thank you for listening. This is Pat Chow, Product Manager at Cisco Optics. The next episode is the fourth and final part of my conversation with Ron Horan. Until next time.